In terms of gross tonnage, we're actually larger than the output of many states or countries. So if you look at the MMPR program in Canada, they produced 29 tons in 2016. If you look at Washington State, they were at approximately 9 tons in 2016. Colorado sold approximately 146 tons of flower in 2016. And last year, my company manufactured over 300 tons, which is more than the entire country of Canada combined with Washington and Colorado's flower output.
That was Michael Brubeck, CEO of Centuria, the largest manufacturer of cannabis in North America. He's also the author of Tipping the Scale, the book that changed everything you know about investing in cannabis. He very well may be the king of cannabis. Just keep on listening. 2, 3, 4. Hey, podcast people, John here. You are listening to Season 2, Episode 14 of Make Moves. This episode features Michael Brubeck, and I am really excited to share this one with you. You know, this episode has a couple of nice lessons about intention and the power of intention in it. Both what Michael has accomplished through his intentions to really rethink and dominate the cannabis market, and also a little bit about what I've been able to accomplish with my intentions. For a while now, I've wanted to do a feature on someone who grows cannabis. I live in California. There's a long history of it being legal and then illegal and now legal again to grow cannabis. It's always in the news about how it's legal in the state, illegal in the nation. Lots of interesting questions around legality. And I thought, boy, it sure would be neat to meet someone who grows cannabis. I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to do that, but I knew it was something I wanted to do, and I put it out there in the universe as an intention. So, a couple of months ago, I was on this dinner cruise, and I was chatting with this nice woman that I had just met, and I got talking about Make Moves, and she asked me some of the guests that I had had on and some of the people that I would like to have on, and I mentioned this idea of wanting to find a cannabis farmer. And she said, I know this guy, and I met him through an entrepreneurs group that I'm part of, and he's really growing cannabis at a very large scale. He's a very interesting gentleman. And, so immediately my ears perked up, and I wanted to figure out how I could ask this woman who I barely knew if she could help me make a connection. And ultimately, I didn't feel really comfortable doing that. I could imagine that a guy who grows cannabis for a living might not want a friend to introduce a stranger to him. And so I let it go for a little while. But she did mention his name in passing, and I did have the power of Google on my side, so I looked him up, like I do. So as I was perusing Google, I noticed that there were some pictures of him with Richard Branson, and I noticed that he had written a book, and I noticed that he had been interviewed by all of the magazines in the cannabis marijuana industry. And then I realized that there was a website, and he was the CEO of a rather large company. So I figured maybe I should do some more homework. I got a copy of his book, and I read it from cover to cover. I actually also bought a copy for my son because it was a very, very interesting book. And I realized this was not, some kind of bearded hippie growing pot in the mountains under the radar. This was a guy who had a lot of business smarts and had really learned the science of the whole entire industry. He is actually disrupting, revolutionizing, and reinventing the whole entire industry as I say this. The guy is a genius. So, of course, now I have to figure out how am I going to get in touch with this guy? And of course, when I don't know what to do, I always just try the simplest thing first. So I looked him up on Facebook and I messaged him. Who knew that he would reply? But he did. So I guess that for me was a lesson about intention. You take an idea, you give it some intention, and then you do the work. And sometimes it pays off. Sometimes it all works out. And it happened to work out in this case, and I'm very excited for you to hear this interview. But before I jump in, I want to make a few simple requests of you listeners out there. Please, please do Subscribe, rate, and review this show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like an episode in particular, please share it with some friends. It helps grow the audience, and I want to make sure that the creative risk takers that take their time to come on this show and share what they know about the world have the biggest audience possible. Also, I'd love to see you in the Make Moves exclusives group on Facebook. It's a tight-knit community of insiders for the show, and I'd love to get some of your feedback there. You're also welcome to email me anytime at feedback@makemoveswithjohn.com, or you can hit us up on any of the social media channels. Just search Make Moves with John. We'll be there. Okay, I'm going to check in with you about the halfway point, play a little bit of music, and I'll also check in with you at the end. Right now, I'm going to turn off my mic, you turn on your ears, and happy listening. Hey, Michael, man, thanks for coming on Make Moves.
Hey, John.
I really appreciate you making some time. I've got a lot of questions for you. I'm going to try and move quickly through some of them, but I guess given your unique background, you know a lot about the cannabis market. I was hoping maybe for listeners out there, I could just ask you a couple of questions to sort of help frame what is this cannabis market, this thing that you're in. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So, I mean, I guess in general, how big is the cannabis market?
Currently in the United States, both the legal, gray, and black markets are estimated around $40 billion in revenue per year. Globally, that's $200 billion. And also that's an estimate, as we don't really have metrics on black markets.
Got it. And so how big is that compared to other more familiar markets, like maybe eggs or something like that?
Yeah, chicken and eggs, poultry market's about 40 billion, 42 to be exact. The nut market is around 40 billion. Tobacco is around 40 billion. So the domestic cannabis industry is roughly the size of those industries.
Okay, so this is a really big industry, which is really just let's put it this way. It's big and it's new, and it's already the size of these well-established markets.
Correct.
Okay, that's huge. It's legal in some states in the U.S., but not federally, which I think has got some interesting wrinkles that we'll move into a little bit later. But I was wondering, I was reading your book, and you mentioned this story about Chobani yogurt, and I was wondering, could you maybe tell listeners that brief comparison you make between the cannabis market and the yogurt market? It really helped me understand a little bit where you're coming from.
Yeah, one of the greatest entrepreneurial stories in the last 25 years. Hamdi Ulukaya is a Turkish immigrant who moved to New York and started a yogurt company. Now, the reason he picked yogurt was because he felt there was a gap in the market where the U.S. simply didn't have a good enough quality yogurt. He created Greek yogurt, as it's now a household name, but 20 years ago, no one knew what Greek yogurt was. And he created it at a price point that was competitive enough to take market share from the biggest names, the biggest household names in the yogurt industry. And, I think that cannabis has a similar problem, but it's definitely not in quality. Cannabis's problem is value, and consumers see it. And as soon as a company in these state markets can address that quality issue, I think that we're going to see traditional operators having a really big consumer problem.
And that's just because they're suddenly going to be matched up against people that are thinking very differently about solving the problems of supply? Or
to put it shortly, yes.
Okay. Really interesting. Thank you. So earlier on in your career, you had some major success. I don't know if it would be called the retail side, but you ran some dispensaries and collectives, and that went well. And I guess, that experience and these market circumstances that we're currently in, which we just described, it really got you thinking about the supply side of the legal cannabis industry. At least that's how I understand it. And I was wondering, was there a specific moment when you really knew this was your direction? Did something just tick in your head, or was this sort of a slow grown conclusion?
Centuria, as it stands today, it was definitely a very clear, concise business model in my head that I knew existed on the first day I stepped foot in a dispensary. I was talking to the dispensary owner about his supply chain. And his response was that his entire dispensary was supplied by between 600 and 800 patient cultivators. And to me, that just seemed ridiculous. There was no checks on quality assurance. There was no consistency in supply. There was very little consistency in pricing. So I just felt that for someone to make a huge splash in this industry, all they had to do was identify efficient farming systems and distribution systems to get those to dispensaries.
Okay. So it was an obvious that you just saw the need based on your experience there. It was really obvious. So fast forward a little bit, we'll have to skip a few years of your life to get here, but Centuria is now the largest cannabis manufacturer by gross tonnage in North America. Is that correct?
As far as the data we have, yes, we are.
Okay.
If you look at what the largest manufacturers in the state of Colorado or places where we have large data sets, Centuria is larger than any manufacturer. In terms of gross tonnage, we're actually larger than the output of many states or countries. So if you look at the MMPR program in Canada, they produced 29 tons in 2016. If you look at Washington State, they were at approximately 9 tons in 2016. Colorado sold approximately 146 tons of flower in 2016. And last year, my company manufactured over 300 tons, which is more than the entire country of Canada combined with Washington and Colorado's flower output.
Wow, you're not messing around. Are you running at capacity?
Not even close. If you look at what our farming capacity is, we're operating at less than 5%. If you look at what our extraction capacity is, we're only running probably 10 to 20 days a year. And as that manufacturing capacity continues to expand, we continue operating at a massive shortage of what total throughput could possibly be if the demand was there.
So as demand grows, you're basically poised to scale up at tremendous levels. I mean, like almost mind-blowing levels. You're already producing more than a lot of states in Canada combined, and you could 10x that.
We could 10x it inside of a season. I don't think there's really any company in the United States that can handle that kind of growth sustainably.
Wow. And I guess something that I found interesting, what is your production cost per gram of, what would you measure it by, per gram of flower or per gram of plant?
We measure by just per gram of biomass.
Okay.
As it's just the easiest way of comparing apples to apples inside of an industry. So if you look at what biomass costs are based on the public reporting of companies in Canada, Canadian companies are averaging between $3 and $3.50 per gram of finished product. They're turning to sell that in the market between $8 and $12, which I think is highway robbery. Companies that I've either consulted for or evaluated in the United States, electricity costs alone in an indoor nursery are $1.65. You usually see production costs ranging between about $2.25 to $3. Our historical price in 2016 was 4.4 cents a gram, and in 2017 we brought that down to a penny.
Wow. So, I guess I want to ask, these estimates about how big is the U.S. market and 40 billion, is that based on the traditional understanding that it costs growers about $3.50 a gram to grow, or is that based on like where you can get it for like pennies on the dollar to grow that much biomass?
The estimates that we have from companies like Rand Corporation, those are actually revenue numbers. So they're saying, okay, well, the gross revenues of legal, illegal markets combined are roughly $40 billion a year.
Wow. And I think it's interesting that they include illegal markets as part of the calculation. But I guess why wouldn't you? Up until very recently, it wasn't a legal market in a lot of places. So something I noticed is Centuria has this big focus on oils and extraction versus flower. Or at least that's the way it seems based on your website at this point. Why is that? Or is that just sort of a temporary thing?
Well, the reason for that's twofold. First and foremost, the flower market is an ever decreasing share of a market as cannabis markets mature. So if you looked at, let's say, Colorado, at the turn of legalization. You can actually see flower consumption being a much higher percentage of overall gross revenues in this state. Whereas if you look at it today, it's barely over half, and it's declining every year. And so in terms of the growing cannabis market and where future markets are going to be, it's an extract-based product. So that could be extracts themselves, it could be e-liquids or edibles, all which use extracted oils.
I see.
Secondly, flower markets are extremely labor intensive. We do not let hands touch plants in our company. One of the reasons that our cost is so low is that we have focused on the mechanization of cannabis manufacturing for the last decade. We started, machine harvesting plants a number of years ago, and we've just become more and more efficient at creating an ultra high quality product that doesn't have a hand touching it.
Interesting. So when I was doing my homework on Centuria, a few things jumped out at me as compared to maybe, I guess, what your competitors would be, if that's the right word, competitors. And I'm going to sort of just lay out these 4 things, and then I was hoping I could ask you a couple of questions about each. So you are, I guess, a combination of outdoor greenhouse farm that's organic, non-GMO, kosher, versus something like a high-tech indoor farm. You're using state-of-the-art production and farm techniques from other types of crops and plants. You're built to scale way beyond where you currently are operating, and you don't really have that many barriers, I guess, except for maybe legal barriers. And you're an international company. Is that right? You're international?
You're correct on all of those. Okay. Yes.
Let me ask a couple of questions, just because these things caught my mind, or captured my imagination a little bit. Is being outdoor and organic and non-GMO and kosher and all that, is that the result of a better business model or better science, or is it responding to a demand or perceived demand in the market, or is it both? What? How did that come up when most of us think of like high-tech farms as the wave of the future, but maybe high tech. I mean, I guess high tech indoor.
So I think that we've just tried to be as responsible with the environment as possible, and that starts out with really what is your methodology for generating photosynthetic activity in the plant. And for me, I think it's grossly irresponsible for cultivators or companies to use electricity to generate photosynthesis when we have this amazing thing called the sun that's for free. And when that eats up, over 50% of your production costs, it just seems like a pretty boneheaded decision to ever utilize that as a strategy.
Yeah, I guess now that you say it, why would you turn the lights on when you just have the sun? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And now, so all these techniques are innovative, and they're efficient. And it's sort of maybe you don't know the answer, but why aren't all the other competitors thinking this way? How come they're just trying to use the same old methods at a bigger scale to meet this growing demand? What is?
Well, I think it's actually just a general assumption that the cannabis industry is making that's their fatal flaw. It's the Achilles heel of this industry, and it's what I really tried to highlight in this book. Companies that lack the ability to scale will fail when they end up competing with more efficient business models, which is an inevitability within the next 5 years. And I think that the reason that companies haven't made these changes is because the market hasn't forced them to. And so when someone says, "Oh, hey, we're going to get our LP, our licensed producer, permit in Canada, what should the business model be?" Everyone's saying, "Well, the way that we've done it for the last 20 years is to get a huge warehouse and to put in a bunch of lights, and then we're going to put in a bunch of plants, and we're going to sell those plants for $12 a gram." And that's a great business model, as long as nothing changes. But the problem with economics is that they're incredibly these forces are incredibly dynamic. We're not going to see the only reason that cannabis is $12 a gram in Canada or can sell for that amount is because of two artificial factors. You have artificial risk, which essentially has been removed, with the introduction of the MMPR and then the introduction of recreational laws this summer. And you have an artificial restraint on production due to the permitting process. Now, as markets become more free, price goes down and quality goes up. Now, companies that are locked into these production models to where they're saying, well, our cost of goods is $3.53 per gram, they're going to have a really difficult time competing when a company goes to market with an equal or better product with a retail product of 80 or a retail price of 80 cents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that as a big problem. I guess. I'll ask you more about this a little bit later. I have a question about, the information you're sharing in your book. But it sounds like a lot of the people in this industry need to read your book. As far as, you're one of the first movers, I guess, in a lot of ways in this industry. And, I was wondering, is your ability to scale quickly sort of an ace in the hole in your business model? I mean, there is a big difference between being the best and then also being the best and able to grow fast enough to capture market share. Or being the best is maybe a nebulous way of saying it. You have great product, but you also have great product in a way that you can scale quickly to capture market share, which I guess at some point some legal things are going to change and it's going to be the Wild West and someone's going to capture the market.
Right. So I think when you talk about being the best, you don't see Centuria even attempting to win any Emerald Cups, Cannabis Cups. We will never be that company. We will never be the hand-tended cultivator that's trying to create just the perfect product. For us, it's creating an extremely high-quality product that's 1/10 the price of the rest of the market. And if we can do that, to us, that's being ultra successful. And I think when it comes to when it comes to scalability, I just think that right now I think that it's a huge, terrible assumption that Canadian companies or U.S. companies are building out these indoor nurseries with the assumption that they can spend $8 or upwards of $40 million an acre, and then have between 80 and 135 employees per acre, and somehow that's scalable. Or if you look at a completely mechanized farm like ours, we have less than 2 people an acre, and our cost of expansion is about $28,000, for per acre on a 500-acre plot, and that includes all of our farming equipment, tractors, combines, dryers, extraction equipment, packaging, etc. And so when you say, okay, well, if you have a $40 million an acre nursery, let's say you want to grow by a factor of 100, how do you go out and raise that much money, and how do you go out and hire 13,500 people? The answer is that you don't. And therefore, your business model has already failed. Whereas if you're talking about, having to raise, 1/100th of the cost and hire 1/100th of the labor, that's a lot more palatable, both to an operator and for investors seeking to, really make a splash in this industry.
Huh. Yeah, well, that's smart. So I guess sort of my last question before we move on to some slightly different topics, but about Centuria is you went international, and that's sort of a scale that I don't know if anybody else has done in the U.S. Maybe but I know that some of that decision probably had to come into play, by lessons learned, maybe the hard way from your previous company, which was Delta Allied Growers. Is that correct?
That is correct. And
so, what kinds of things were you learning the hard way that made you think that going international was the answer?
Well, Delta Allied Growers was the first licensed, permitted nursery in North America ever. It was a 44-acre site, which is probably 100 times larger than the next largest cultivation facility at the time. We thought that federal policy was on our side with the Ogden Memo, and then the Ogden Memo had a full 180-degree reversal virtually overnight. 8 governors were targeted. They were told that they, as well as their staff, would be jailed if they were to sign medical cannabis regulations in their state. In addition to those 8 governors, my company was the first company targeted. As Ben Wagner conveyed to my attorney, I was facing 20 years to life in prison based on our operations. And so at that point, we decided it would be a prudent decision to cease all U.S. operations. And as a result, I wasn't going to stop conducting research into how to, efficiently grow 10,000 acres of cannabis. And so our only option was to get a federal permit to operate. And since that wasn't going to happen in the United States, we found other countries that would gladly host us.
Huh. I think that's just sort of telling about your personality. This is an observation, not really a question, but you basically ran up against what seems like a deal breaker problem, legal issues in the United States for, for a company that's sort of on the edges of what's known. And instead of just, I guess on some level you threw in the towel with that company and you had to, but also, like they tried to draw a box around you and say, you can't come out of the box. And you just drew a bigger circle around that box and said, nah, what we'll do is we'll go international. I just think it's interesting that for whatever reason, your solution wasn't to think smaller. It was to think way bigger than the problem.
Well, I think if you look at all cannabis entrepreneurs under the Bush administration, we're talking 10, almost 15 years ago now. I think all of those individuals thought so far outside the box they couldn't even see the box. And it's those pioneers that my success is based on. And I just think that I happen to be at the right place at the right time with the right skill set. And also, I think just not quitting. Those two things combined, is why we're here today.
Huh. Well, I feel like we should talk a little bit about Delta Allied Growers, just because I think it was an important part in maybe your life and your career, and a lot of lessons were learned there. But I'll just reiterate. So, I think a lot of the wisdom and innovation, and maybe some of the investors, I don't know if you had investors follow you to Centuria, but they came out of your experience at Delta Allied Growers. As you said, that was the first industrial scale cultivation only permitted cannabis farm in North America. So definitely leading edge here. And you were experimenting, trying new things. You were also, as I understand it, really trying to cross every T, dot every I, live within the state legalities that you had to. Of course, there were some federal legalities that you couldn't outrun, I guess. You were smart. You got incredible results. Your model worked. And then the company just didn't quite survive because of these federal regulations that were, I guess the tide was just not going your direction in that moment. So, you had a lot of success, I guess, with the model of Delta Allied Growers, and it didn't actually survive the company. But I'm wondering, what were the biggest wins or the biggest successes that you felt like you took out of that experience with Delta Allied Growers?
Well, the biggest win that came out of Delta Allied Growers was how we approached cultivating cannabis. The first thing I did was I obviously, being in dispensaries, I'd probably spoken to approximately 5,000 growers at that point in my career. And I took about the top 20 guys and really started drawing them down. And those 20 guys made it to about 5 guys. Now, I spoke to those 5 guys at length about potentially being the master grower, the position that's commonly held in the cannabis industry, and found that all 5 were not qualified. The reason for that is that I think cannabis growers really aren't used to working, in a corporate commercial environment to where they're punching in every morning at 7 a.m. and punching out at 3 or 4. That simply doesn't really work for most cannabis people. That's actually why I think they're in the industry, because they can make their own hours, and that flexibility with the income does not outweigh the risk that they're taking. And so what we ended up doing is going to the largest plant science department in the United States. And that's always been what we've done. When we have a problem, we find the best person in the world, and I will fly to his house or his office, and I will get the answer. And usually end up getting him to work for the company. So what I did in this time is I went to UC Davis. It's the largest plant science department in the United States. I went to the head of the plant science department, who happened to be an expert in ornamental horticulture. The beauty of that is how you grow roses or strawberries is very similar to how you grow cannabis. At least if you're talking about a product that has to be harvested on a specific hour or at least a specific day. So it can be shipped to the United States. We're talking about roses here. And then sold in the store and have an optimum window in which its value is optimized. The rose industry is really similar to cannabis. And so I started talking to the head of the plant science department about how he would grow cannabis, having never grown it before. Now, from someone who has never grown cannabis before, he looked at our original model, which was an indoor nursery, warehouse space, lights, and he said, "There's no way this can scale. First of all, you're going to need about 25 megawatts of electricity, which your region doesn't have, and they can't provide you. So if your nursery wants to get to capacity, you can't do it with artificial light. So get rid of artificial light." For photosynthesis. We use it for changing photo period, but not for photosynthesis. So at that point, we became a greenhouse model instantly. And then looking at other agricultural industries that we could adopt technology from. We looked at strawberry farming. We borrowed a lot from that, and other flowers. And so what ended up happening within the course of about 6 months is we took an incredible graduate from that plant science department, who still works with us today, and really completely started from scratch, from a blank slate of how to grow cannabis. And it was all based on a much different business model than what we see today. And I think that primarily what we're seeing today is indoor nurseries using systems that are simply larger versions of systems that existed 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and that's not the future. That's just a larger version of the past, I guess.
Correct.
So, I mean, ultimately, the company didn't make it and you had to throw in the towel. Was it really just sort of the legality, or I guess the risk of the legalities, the federal legalities, that was the ultimate deal breaker that just made you think you couldn't move forward?
Everything at Delta Ally Growers was perfect, with the one exception that Ben Wagner was threatening me with life in prison. So at that point, we decided we just close our doors and start a new hand in another country. So
in your book, you mention a story of having to dispose of tons of cannabis when you close the doors. Could you tell that story really quick?
I honestly can't. I'm sorry. My attorneys will never let me disclose any more information other than the words that are in that book. So,
okay. Well, listeners, we're going to have links to the book because I think you're going to want to read it.
Here we go.
With permission of Ropeadope Records, you are listening to the song Killaweed from Angelo Moore and the brand new Step off the album Centuries of Heat.
Out in the great state of California, talking about a state of mind, somewhere north of Frisco Bay, where the redwoods meet the wine. There's a people with a purpose so divine. They coax from the earth the very food of God's sweet Valentine. And the growers on the ridges, they got everything they need. But down in San Jose, they say, whoa, that killer weed. Whoa, that killer weed. Whoa, that killer weed. Down in San Jose, they say, whoa, that killer weed. Ah, yeah. There was a grower extraordinaire. They called him One-Eye Jim. His plane went down.
I want to shift a little bit and ask, about you as a person, and hopefully you'll come along for this ride. But let's just sort of, let's take a step back here. Some observations. So you were recognized at a pretty early age, like 10 or 11 or something like that, as being really gifted in math. As I understand it, you went to college close to home at a pretty young age, around 15 or something. You transferred to University of Hawaii at age 19. You sort of, you're in college, you get the bug, you start a painting company that overcame all kinds of obstacles, which we don't really have time to discuss, but you were doing well. And then ultimately you dropped out of college and went into mortgage banking. And as I understand it, sort of the inefficiencies of the company that you were working for, like you just couldn't deal with that. So you started your own mortgage banking company. And then right around that time, Senate Bill 420 passed and dispensaries become this big thing. And somehow you shift into working, turning around dispensaries and collectives and whatnot. And then again, as you mentioned earlier, the inefficiencies of too many suppliers drove you nuts. So you jump into the supply side of the cannabis industry. And I guess, now as you run the largest cannabis manufacturer in North America. And, so sort of just to sort of close up this thought on it, you've always had the skills. You've always had the smarts. You always do your homework. You always do the work, not the homework. You actually do the work. For whatever reason, you always seem to want to refuse to accept the way it's being done. You want to innovate something, and you seem fixated on more efficient models. Did I summarize sort of maybe almost the good and bad of you right there? Did I get that close?
Yeah, I think you said it better than I ever could.
Oh, good. All right. Well, I can write some biographies for you later if you want. So this is, there's no right or wrong answer here, but I'm wondering, why do you always think that a better way is possible?
Well, I think if we look at, the history of human evolution, we're the reason that you and I are both here today is because, there's enough food for us to eat because, previous generations did things better than the generations before them. So I think progress is just in our genes.
So how do you personally sort of cultivate this? I guess, I think of it as like a stubborn inability to accept the norm, and then simultaneously also sort of cultivate the courage to do the changes that are necessary to push progress. I mean, like, it's one thing to have a good idea, but it's a different thing to do a good idea. Is that just in your nature, or do you have mentors or role models that made you think this was possible?
I blame it all on my parents. Most kids will approach their parents and say, "Oh, hey, mom, dad, I have this impossible idea." And they'll say, "Well, son, daughter, I'm sorry, but that's against, the laws of physics. That just simply isn't possible." My parents, those words never left their mouth. They always said, "Michael, why don't you try it?" And so just, I think, a lifetime of encouragement and never telling me that anything's impossible is why it's kind of what's caused this mentality. And so for me, I just like being in a creative space every day. Whether it's whether I was growing cannabis or working in another industry or composing music, I simply want to be in a creative space where I can constantly make something new. And this industry and this business allows me to do that.
So, I mean, you always seem to be asking different questions and doing different homework than everybody else. And I'm wondering, do you think that's sort of the outcome of who you are as a person, or is that just sort of just an actual market requirement to be thinking differently right now in the cannabis industry?
I don't think it actually takes terribly innovative thinking to be successful in the cannabis space right now. If you look at the biggest deployments of capital inside the space internationally, you actually see the same model being duplicated, and it's pretty archaic. You see indoor nurseries, you see large volumes of employees of labor, and you see high retail prices, that are essentially, creating an optimal product for the optimal place in the market. I simply don't agree with building those business models, as, I think they're a bit futile if you're going to get wiped out by someone that's a lot more efficient. And so, we're not the largest revenue company in the space by any means. We're right in the middle of the pack. But I feel that the most valuable thing that we've created is a business model that will stand the test of time, in the next decade. Will we see extremely high labor count, in nurseries in 5 years? I simply don't think so. And so I just think it was a very intelligent decision to start making those changes, 10 years ago, and make those systems better.
In your book, you describe yourself as an entrepreneur with a creative streak. You describe kind of a funny story about how you reluctantly took piano lessons as a kid. You have a seriously famous jazz musician uncle with the last name Brubeck. Creativity was sort of a heavy value in your family, something that your parents cultivated. And I guess all of that's maybe, somehow exercised your right brain and made you prioritize creativity. And I was wondering, do you think creativity gives you any significant advantages or maybe disadvantages in business? being of the...
Oh, absolutely both. I think creativity gives you a massive advantage, and it gives you an equally severe disadvantage. I think that one of the issues that we've had, every time you grow by a factor of 10, by throughput, by tonnage or by revenue, you're looking at some serious growing pains. And, as a result of that creativity, yes, we see growth, but at what cost? And for us, every single year, there's been essentially a system-wide failure at some level that has cost us millions of dollars. If we were just trying to copy ourselves from last year and not grow, that would ultimately be, on our bottom line. But for me, it's not about the revenue. It's about developing, better technology. I just want the sandbox to play in. And as a result of that, we're successful. But that's not our primary focus as a company.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious about you as a person. If things like math and creativity come easy to you, do you feel like you have to watch out for different personal traps? Like, and I'm just sort of thinking, like, some people are really, really pretty and they never really have to, exercise their smarts because the world just kind of falls around them. Like, with your unique skills, do you feel like you personally have to look out for other pitfalls, like to avoid being lazy and resting on your laurels?
I don't think laziness is an issue in my life. I think that I live a very regimented day. So I have a morning routine in which I don't look at any screens. So computer screens, phone screens, I don't look at screens for my morning routine. The first time that I actually look at a screen is when I start working. And that's about 2 hours after I wake up. And then I take an hour break in the middle of the day. I continue working until approximately 6 or 8 p.m., where I have a hard stop. And then I have a bedtime, 10 p.m. And I have an entire, evening routine about winding down once I unplug from work. And I do that every single day. I eat probably 6 foods, which is, 90% of my caloric intake. I'm a creature of habit, because I feel by creating efficient systems at the micro level inside your day-to-day life or hour-to-hour life, it allows you to have far more capacity in every other part of your life to be creative, to go try new things, and to maximize the amount of hours we have in our waking lives.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you found the efficiency for life. I want to ask, you operate in an industry that rubs up against the edge of legal limits in some ways. I mean, I think you're doing everything within your legal limits, but cannabis has certainly got a long history of being at sort of the edge of legality. And I was wondering, your book, the forward is written by an attorney. I assume that's someone you spoke to a lot. You seem to be pretty risk tolerant. But I'm wondering, as an entrepreneur with a creative streak, given where you're operating, what kinds of things feel like creative risks to you? What feels like a big risk, knowing that you're already sort of on the edge of a risky industry?
Well, John, if you're going to do something, do it right. So don't go in and half-ass anything. You're just going to fail. So, if I made the decision to enter the cannabis industry almost 15 years ago, we're going to do it one way, and that's the right way, according to me. But I think that's just the attitude that every entrepreneur has to have to be successful, is, to give it 100% no matter what you're doing. This path was rife with failure. The day that Delta Ally Growers was essentially shuttered by the Department of Justice, it's that at that moment, that was seemingly the worst day of my life. My entire adult life had been working towards that one goal, and now, that had just vanished, overnight. But, now, at this point in my life, I can look at that day and actually see that was the best day of my life, because had everything worked out perfectly, and had my company, not been caught up in the Obama kind of prosecutions of 2011 to 2013, we'd still be operating in a 44-acre site, selling to California dispensaries, and that's just very limiting in scope. Whereas now, we're on 3 or 4 continents in both manufacturing and sales. We have a footprint to where we could realistically take 10 or 20% of the North American market inside of one season, and that's something that just couldn't be said if I was stuck, on a small farm in California.
Huh. Yeah. Well, you found the upside there. In your book, you describe a little bit about how you and your father spent a lot of time talking together, and how you learned a lot about business from him. And, I'm always wondering about people's support networks. I was wondering, could you tell listeners a little bit about like who is in your support network? Who do you call when you need a friend, or what kind of things weigh on you where you decide you want to call someone? What is that like for you? Because you're pushing hard. You must encounter some personal moments where you need some support.
Yeah, my father was absolutely that person while he was here. And so I'd say that between the ages of 19 and about 27, we spoke every single day for an hour, 7 days a week, especially in periods of high growth that could be 90 to 120 minutes. And so having a mentor that was willing to spend that many hours going over short, medium, and long-term goals every single day, that was invaluable. Some people have an MBA program. Some people have, a mentor through their industry. I had my father, and that was just an invaluable educational asset that allowed me to get to where I am today. In terms of, on a day-to-day, like who do I have to support, or who do I have as, people to truly celebrate with? The Maverick 1000, it's a group of like-minded entrepreneurs that feel that, they can change the world. And so it's that circle of friends that, I'll pick up the phone and call when something great happens, when something bad happens. They're people who understand that, just like me, they're risking, their lives, their livelihood, to be successful in their endeavors. And so I think that the most important thing for entrepreneurial's, well-being and health is to have, someone that understands you and someone that you can talk to. And I think, thank God every day that I have these people in my life.
Yeah, it's the Maverick 1000. Is that what you called it? Is that something I can look up or Google and find them, or is this like a secret society?
You can Google it. It's only partially secretive.
Okay. So in your book, Tipping the Scale, the book that changed everything you know about investing in cannabis, I read the book cover to cover. I actually bought a copy for my son. You give away a lot of insight and wisdom. I mean, a lot. And I'm just curious, do you have any sense of fear that you're giving your competitors too much of your advantage, or how does it feel so comfortable giving away your sort of secret thoughts on all of this?
I think it's really, it's telling of a new entrepreneur when they're afraid of people stealing their ideas. I think that if your ideas are good enough, everyone's going to think that you're crazy, and they're just going to leave them alone. And if anyone does steal your ideas, they're not you, and they can't execute like you. And so that's just how I feel about my company. I'm happy to give every person in the world our 2016 playbook. What we were doing in 2016, versus what we're doing now is radically different. Our cost has gone down another 80%. Our footprint has expanded probably 100 to 200%. And so I'm happy to talk about things that made us successful 2 years ago, and I'm happy for people to copy us and to take some pages from that playbook. But I understand that by the time that anyone can actually execute the things I was talking about, it's going to be 3 or 4 years down the road, and we're going to be in an entirely different place in our trajectory for research and development as well as market positioning.
Huh. Okay, well, so I guess in some sense you are giving away very valuable information, but you've got such a head start. I guess if anyone was going to try and use it against you, they're already late to the party. Yeah, and the other thing that people need to realize is that this isn't a small regional market, or we're not like a similar company in a similar industry in a small town. We're talking about a global industry that has over $200 billion a year in revenue today, and there's not a single company in the world that has a 1% market share. So I'm happy for people to copy us. We'd love to be the company that's the first company to get 1% market share. But it would make you even happier if someone else said, "Hey, I read your book and we took that 1% market share with the information." I mean, that'd be great to see someone else do it before we did. Well, it's a big market. I think there's room for everybody, and somehow I get the hunch that you're going to be among the first to get the market share. It's in terms of like advice that if maybe someone came to you, an aspiring entrepreneur, and maybe they were interested at the working at the edge of a known market, maybe I don't know, blockchain technology or cryptocurrency or maybe artificial intelligence. It has ethical ramifications or something. What kind of advice would you have for someone who came to you and said, how do I approach working at the edge of these? How do I approaching at the edge of the known?
Well, I think, I can't offer anyone advice in those industries, because if you're working in blockchain or you're working in AI, it means you're way smarter than I am. And, we're just a farming company. But the one thing I could actually give them of value is to get your own life in order, to create healthy habits every single day that will enable you to operate at the best of your ability. That's physically, mentally, spiritually, etc.
Huh. Solid advice. So all I need to do now is get physically and spiritually together, and I'll have some of the trifecta.
Yeah, start meditating, man. Just do it.
I've actually been thinking about that. I'm hesitant to make New Year's resolutions because I have to do all the things that I set my mind to, and it's not easy to say change your life through meditation, but I've been thinking about it. Okay. Sort of my last question about you, and then we can have some sort of closing thoughts. When do you think you're going to be able to look at your life's work and say, yep, I did it. I'm satisfied with this. What's that marker for you?
I think every morning I look at my life and that's how I feel. I feel that, I'm working for much different things now than I was 5 or 10 years ago. And just the fact that I can wake up every day and my sole purpose is to, maximize the value of my company and to do things on a more granular level that have really never been done before, in the world. So the fact that I get to play in that space, I'm just happy to be there. And so for me, there's really nowhere else there's no destination to arrive to. This is it.
Man, that's great. You're living a fulfilled life. Okay, so some easy questions for you here. Where can people find out more about Centuria? What's the best place to get solid information?
Yeah, check out our website, centuriafoods.com.
Okay. And your book, Tipping the Scales, is there a preferred place that you like people to pick that up?
Found on Amazon. Search for Tipping the Scale by Michael Brubeck. It's got a giant pot leaf on the cover.
Okay. I will definitely provide links to all that stuff in the show notes. I think I got to close it up here. I want to thank you for your time. I hope we get to keep in touch. I wish you great success. I find your model fascinating, and I find you fascinating, just that you have the temperament and sort of the tenacity to do this. So thank you for what you do in this world, and thanks for coming on Make Moves.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right, there you have it, everybody. This episode is coming to a close. Big thanks to Michael for coming on the show. I don't know what you listeners thought about this episode, but I found it really inspirational to talk with Michael. He's really thinking and doing things in such a different way, and there's so much to do in this world, and I'm pretty convinced that we can do it so much better if we're willing to be open to the thought of doing things in different ways. I'm going to work on that in my life. Maybe you'll work on that too. Big thanks to Ropeadope Records and Angelo Moore and the brand new Step for letting us feature the song Killaweed. Couldn't be more appropriate for this episode. Please swing by MakeMovesWithJohn.com. You'll be able to catch links to purchase Michael's book, learn more about his company, Centuria, and you'll also be able to find out more about Angelo Moore and the brand new Step. Okay, everyone, thanks for your patient listening. I hope you got some good out of this. I sure did. Looking forward to bringing you a new episode soon. But until then, take good care of yourselves. Go out there and make moves.